Principal Matters Podcast, episode 406. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the School Leaders Podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. This week, we're going to be talking about thinking inclusive with my special guest, Tim Villegas. Tim Villegas is the Director of Communications for the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education, and he is also the founder of Think Inclusive, which is the blog, podcast, and social media handle of MCIE. Tim has 16 years of experience in public education as a teacher and district support specialist. His focus now is on how media and communications can promote inclusive education for all learners. Tim Villegas, welcome to Principal Matters Podcast. I like to ask my guests to fill in the blanks on that intro and tell listeners something else they may be surprised to know about you.
Surprised to know. Well, I like to run. Will, do you run?
I do like to run, and I have never done a scientific polling, but I'm going to say so far this year, 90% of my guests like to run. So there must be something about people. There must be something about educators and how we like decompress stress. How long have
Yes.
you enjoyed running?
I started running in college. I actually started really liking to run in middle school, back when they did like the presidential fitness tests,
Uh-huh.
um, and you had to run the mile. I was always like, yes. I was the weird one. That was like, this is so fun. And and I didn't do any. I played basketball and baseball, so running was part of the conditioning, which was not a problem. It was still fun for me, but I never did anything as far as like track or cross country or
Yeah.
anything like that. But when I got into college, I started to run on my own. And this was before, now you have Garmin's and watches and you can track like down to the, your cadence and all this like really high tech statistical analysis. But I would run around the neighborhood, and then to figure out how far I ran, I would take my car and drive my route and be like, okay, that was, 5 miles.
Oh, life before GPS.
I know,
That's
right?
great. Yeah, I don't think I started liking running either until I was maybe a junior in college. All the other running experiences I had felt forced and miserable. But something happened that junior year where running began to be a stress relief for me. And then I rediscovered that love when I was a teacher and then as a principal. So, man, yeah, there's a lot of joy in that. So 2 years ago, let me set the stage for listeners.
Sure.
I had the privilege of meeting you and hearing presentations from you and Dr. Carol Quirk, who's MCIE's Director of Special Projects. You guys were in Oklahoma and you were presenting on the roles of administrators in inclusive education. Can you believe it's taken us this long to finally get together and have this conversation? So, before we dive into today's topic, I want you first to just explain what is MCIE and how did you get involved in its work?
Sure. So MCIE stands for the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education. Um, we primarily work with school districts in Maryland, although, as evidenced, right, and 2 years ago, we were in Oklahoma. We were invited by, um, I believe it was the Oklahoma Autism Center,
Mhm.
is what I'm remembering, and we presented on inclusive practices. We have districts we work with in Illinois, um, Arkansas, Virginia, and there's others developing. But our nonprofit has been around since the late 80s, and we started our work with something called the Neighborhood Inclusion Project, and it was in a district in Maryland, and it was really a project that was a combination of educators and families um, that were dedicated to bringing learners that had been segregated in special schools back to their home and neighborhood schools. And it was funded by the Maryland State Department of Education. And that really is what started everything. And then we just kept getting funding from various sources, including the Maryland State Department of Education. So currently we are in, well, we're in a number of districts in various projects. A lot of them are the systems change work, which I'm sure we'll get into. Some it's professional learning workshops, and also we do customized learner planning, which really means getting down at to the learner and schoolhouse level, where we partner with a school to develop an inclusion plan for a particular learner that the team is having a challenge including in general education settings. So that's primarily what we do. I came on in 2020 as a communications director. I don't believe that role existed before I came on. It was mostly, interns, communication specialists type of thing. And it's really part of our strategic plan to get the word out about inclusive practices and disseminate more information about the efficacy and what it actually looks like to uh, go through this school transformation.
Thanks for the background, Tim. So let's set some context for this conversation because you and I both know that that word inclusive means something to you, but it might mean something different to other people.
Sure.
And so the heart of what if I'm understanding correctly, the mission of your organization, the heart of MCIE is to help schools recognize the value of every student, especially those special populations of students who historically have been separated from educational environments or quote unquote regular classroom settings. And you guys have spent years of engaging communities and schools back in the work of recognizing the value of integrated, inclusive special education and quote unquote regular education um, learning happening together. So, so let's start there, and feel free to correct any of my misperceptions. But I want to have this conversation for the benefit of listeners who are mostly principals, assistant principals, district leaders, aspiring leaders, but all of us are teachers at heart. So let's talk about um, in the role of leadership. If you could sit down and have coffee with that principal who's asking you, how can we do better? Let's
Mm,
start first of all with let's start maybe with like distributing roles and responsibilities. Or what are some of the ways that leaders can look across their school spectrum? And we both know that schools can be small, large, urban, suburban, rural. So not everything is exactly the same. But what are some of the general practices that you would share with a leader about how to think about inclusive education and maybe in regard to the way they distribute roles and responsibilities?
sure. Well, my experience in schools as a special education teacher, I understand that um, special education teachers and general education teachers, it 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 depends on the culture of the school, but a lot of times they are separate for various reasons. Okay, one reason could be the classrooms. Um, there are separate classrooms for uh, special education teachers, whether that's a resource room, whether that's a self-contained classroom because it's a disability specific program, or maybe it's just a catch-all special ed classroom. Um, and then sometimes you have something called an inclusion classroom where A lot of times you have co-teaching happening, a general and special education teacher, but not all the classrooms are inclusion classrooms. So um, the collaboration can be difficult. And then you also have, like, think about staff meetings, right? Everyone goes to the staff meeting, and the special education teachers don't always feel like the content that is covered applies to them. Um, and then you have different supervisors, right? You have the special education director and you have special education supervisors. And who are the ones that are, um, doing the walkthroughs, and who are the ones, providing feedback and doing observations for those teachers. And so we really are a disadvantage because we are living and working in two separate systems. Now, it's not like this all over the place, right? Um, but I would say, I don't know if, correct me if I'm wrong, Will, but the vast majority of districts are run this way.
Mhm.
And so we see that as a really, really big barrier when we're talking with an administrator that wants to be more inclusive. I have yet to find a district administrator who doesn't want to be inclusive. You know, I mean, um, people want to be inclusive. It's just they don't know exactly how. Um, and then the other thing is, we talk about mindsets and we talk about belief systems, because inclusion is it's both a philosophy and belief system and a practice. So sometimes it gets a little fuzzy with how we are explaining things. Um, but what is really interesting, Will, is that even if you aren't completely on board with the mindset that all means all, everyone should have access to and be included in general education settings. Once you start changing those practices and you have a leader that is leading that work, then you start to see some of those mindsets shift. And that's been our experience. So if I'm sitting down talking with a district administrator, an assistant superintendent, um, a principal, an assistant principal, and they're saying, we want to be more inclusive, tell us how to do that. Um, we really have to look at the the practices that are going on in the school building and in the district and see where that aligns with um, you know what we're talking about with inclusive practices. We have these quality indicators, inclusive quality indicators, on our website, um, and just one of them is the collaboration time between general and special education teachers. So you know, I would ask anyone to just be reflective about that. Like, how are we allowing time for special and general education teachers to spend time with each other and to collaborate on lessons, to universally design lessons? Because if that isn't happening, you may have an inclusion class, but um, it may not be as effective as you want it to be, because those grade level teams aren't including those special education teachers.
That's such a good example, and it makes me think about how well, even because I've been doing this work for a long time, Tim. I mean, I started my teaching career in 1993, so I mean, I'm 30 plus years now into this process, and so historically, and long before I was in, um, but historically, you're right. We have separated our general and special education teachers and services. But even with the move, and I know you and I both know that term, all means all. And so many of the educators I work with believe that philosophy. But even with that term, it's been a huge lift for some schools to even put teachers into common planning periods. Like, let's get
Hmm.
teachers planning together who share common subject areas. And I remember what a lift that was in master schedules. And the question you're asking is, okay, look at your practices and ask yourself the question, if we really say we're inclusive, you may be already collaborating around common standards and subject areas, but how consistently are your general education and special education teachers collaborating around their curriculum and their standards and their practices? Because if you're not, then it's possible that you're not as inclusive as you think you are. And I'm preaching to the choir because when I think back to um, the last years that I was in the principal position, um, we were just then in the last couple of years I was in that practice introducing co-teaching for the first time. So that it just blows my mind that in the bulk of my career that co-teaching wasn't even happening within our setting until and that was the late 2016 17 in my work, and I know there's schools that may be listening to this right now that are using co-teaching practices and some that aren't. And so let's stay here a little bit longer because I want you to talk about why is this. I think that most educators recognize this tension that exists within our system. What would you describe as the common barriers to inclusive practices? And then let's switch gears and talk about what are some of the solutions that you've seen that have proved effective.
Common barriers. um, there's ooh, the the biggest barrier, aside from some people's mindsets, right? Because that is a big one. But I think the system being so large and kind of itself being a barrier to change, like from districts being so used to running things a certain way. And so when um, new practices are introduced, uh, the the system itself being the barrier. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what's difficult is um, you really need a leader to have a clear vision on what things could be, what things could look like. Because if you don't have that, and then you start, changing things around, um, and let's just, the easiest thing to talk about is inclusive placement, right? Because that's where most people start is, our LREA numbers are low. They're low all across the country, right? But most people think, well, we just have to start move kids from self-contained environments into general education environments. And that does change numbers, right? But if there's nothing else that happens, if you don't look at roles and relationships, and how you're serving students, how you are implementing co-teaching, then the numbers, um, it doesn't reflect what's actually happening in the classroom, and it could be pretty detrimental to
Mm-hmm.
kids because the support isn't there. And so um, it's kind of like we speak with districts and they're really excited about this work, and they're like, let's include everyone. And we appreciate that spirit and the spirit that it comes from. But what we've seen is a more phased in approach where we can actually support, um, and support the infrastructure of the change, because the change process takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years. At least that's what we've seen. Um, Now, some districts um, do it differently, and they just want to they want to include first, and then kind of retrofit. Um, but as much as as much as we want that to happen, we also want a change to be sustainable. And so from our perspective, that's really what we're talking about is um, slow, methodical, but sustainable change.
Yeah. And what I appreciate is the tension you keep touching on, Tim, which is that, and you've said this a couple of different times in different ways. There's both the mindset challenge. How are you actually thinking about the students in your building, and what um, assumptions do you have? What vision do you have? What imagination do you have for inclusive learning? That's one aspect of this. And then the other aspect is, what are the structures, the systems, the protocols um, that you have in place that could be shifted or changed to match what your mindset could be or should be in terms of inclusive. So there's two things happening at the same time. And so I want to just set her a little bit longer, because I want to make sure that as leaders, we have an imagination for what's possible. And sometimes I've worked with a lot of educators who've never seen the examples of what is possible.
Mm,
And so let's take Susie. We'll just make up a name. Let's say
sure.
Susie is an intellectually disabled student placed
Mhm.
into a setting, and traditionally she probably would have been treated in a way that she was placed in a separate location or room with a special education teacher, given her direct one-on-one instruction or small group instruction throughout the day. I want you to give us a different vision for how Susie could be taught, because I think some people think of inclusion as, well, let's set Susie therefore into general classroom settings, maybe with a paraprofessional or support. That may be an option. But there may be another option too that some folks haven't even imagined. So, let's imagine together so that we can think about that mindset of what are some of the possibilities that you've seen with students that traditionally would not have been expected to have been included.
Well, let's imagine that Susie's in middle school because, you know, it's a little bit easier to imagine elementary, but so let's stretch the imagination. Let's say Susie's in seventh grade, and historically she would have been in a multi-grade, um, self-contained classroom, maybe for students with intellectual disabilities. Maybe it's one of those catch-all classrooms because there's not enough students to make a program, but it's just so you have students with on the autism spectrum, students maybe with some behavioral issues, and then you have Susie. Multi-grade classrooms, um, they are not able to provide um, the general curriculum in a way that is um, robust for Susie. So it's a very practical, like, I just want you to think about it practically for Susie. Because if Susie's in seventh grade and she isn't going to language arts a segment, and she's not going to a math segment, um, and she's not going to any science or social studies, but she's receiving all that instruction in that self-contained class, you have 3 grade levels in that class. There's absolutely no way, it's impossible for that teacher to provide all the standards to Susie. And so, okay, well, Tim, at least we're giving them Susie exposure, right? Exposure to those standards. But I want you to think about that. And I want you to think about if that would be okay to just give exposure to those standards for anyone else that is typically developing. And I'll tell you right now, Will, no one would be okay with it. No one. So why are we okay with it for Susie? And it's because without even thinking about it, we have lowered the expectations for Susie. Now, let's say Susie is now in seventh grade language arts, math, and science and social studies. And she may or may not need additional support with the paraprofessional. But let's just say she doesn't have a one-on-one, um, because typically one-on-ones can can be problematic just because they're always there, you know, and you want to develop independence for all students, but especially for students, that maybe have an intellectual disability. But Susie is now receiving instruction that possibly could be modified, right, to her level, but she's receiving the same instruction as any other student in that seventh grade math, English language arts, science, or social studies class or segment. The amount of instruction and the quality of instruction is going to be higher, and it has nothing to do with the teacher. It has everything to do with the amount of time spent in a class that is delivering that kind of instruction. Um, so just right there, we're just talking about presence, just by the mere presence of Susie being in that class, she's receiving more. Now, if we think about the amount of support that could be required for Susie, yes, we could think about modified or designed lessons that are adapted for Susie. But not only will Susie benefit from that adaptation, but other students will benefit from that adaptation, because not everyone, like when we're thinking about differentiation, we're thinking about how we're designing lessons. Um, if we are changing the way that content is being represented in the class, and let's say we're using more visuals, or let's say we're using more hands-on activities for the whole class, Susie's going to benefit because that was designed for her, but everyone actually benefits from that design, even though it may not be specifically designed for them. There's no rule in the law, or in the education law, that says that students can't benefit from something that was designed for maybe a particular student, but has benefits for the entire class. So all those things are just a net positive. And so the more and more you think about how we're supporting Susie, we're really thinking about how are we supporting the entire class. And you can kind of go from there. And when we talk about universally designing lessons, we're really thinking about, okay, who is in my class? And yes, Susie's in there because, you know, she does have an intellectual disability and she has a certain profile. But there are other students that may be reading below grade level, or so some other students that may have some, processing delays, you know, or there could be other students with sensory needs. And so, how are we going to look and see how we can get the most out of delivering instruction for who's in my class?
Mm.
And so uh, that's just a real simple example, but you multiply that across grade levels and across the whole school, it becomes really powerful.
Let's take a moment to thank our sponsors, and then we'll be right back. As a school leader, you have a vision of a thriving, supportive educational environment where every teacher and student can succeed. With DigiCoach, you can turn that vision into reality. Imagine walking into a classroom with DigiCoach on your mobile device. Its customizable look-fors and pre-written feedback statements streamline your feedback process, saving you precious time. You're not just observing, you're actively supporting your teachers while generating data to drive instructional change. With the new coaching plan feature, you can effortlessly document action plans and coaching conversations. This ensures every teacher is supported and you can track their progress related to your campus goals. DigiCoach empowers you to customize the platform to fit your specific needs, reinforcing your vision at every step. And when you need support, the DigiCoach team becomes your team with consulting efforts focused on realizing your organization's goals. By using DigiCoach, you lead your school to remarkable progress. Ready to turn your vision into reality? Visit digicoach.com and tell them that Will Parker sent you. Everyone talks about the power of data-driven instruction, but what does that actually look like? Look no further than IXL, the ultimate online learning and teaching platform for K-12. IXL gives you meaningful insights that drive real progress, and research can prove it. Studies in nearly all 50 states show that schools that use IXL outperform other schools on state tests. Educators who use IXL love that they can easily see how their school is performing in real time to make better instructional decisions. And IXL doesn't stop at just data. IXL also brings an entire ecosystem of resources for your teachers with a complete curriculum, personalized learning plans, and so much more. It's no wonder that IXL is used in 95 of the top 100 school districts. Ready to join them? Visit IXL.com/PM to get started. I just have to reflect on something that you said earlier, because this speaks to mindset, which is that I don't think we're intentionally doing this, but I think that we have historically done this, which is we have historically, like it or not, lowered the standards for Susie because we think that's what's best for Susie and what's best for everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because it's just the way we've done it. And so the
Mm-hmm.
question you're asking is, what would happen if the expectations that you had for Susie were as high as the expectations you had for anyone else? Because Susie's intellectual disability is a reality, but it shouldn't lower the expectation. It might modify the expectation. It might, so like we do with every student, we might need to differentiate the approaches that we have for those deliveries and expectations. But I love that that thinking, Tim. Now, let me be the voice of educators listening to this conversation who you and I often know that in education, we spend a lot of time admiring the problem and not always seeking for the solution. So
Right.
let's just admire the problem for a moment. And then I want you to take me back to solution, because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of educators are going to say, thanks, Tim, for that vision. How am I supposed to do that when I can't even find highly qualified special education teachers? How am I supposed to do that when my populations of kids on IEPs and 504s continue to increase and I'm struggling with hiring and retaining? Um, I think you and I could admire that problem all day long. This is a historic problem, and it's chronic in terms of the lack of the lack of support from both the federal government, who inspired so many of the ideas that we have for special education law without the funding that was promised along with it, and states that don't also provide the kind of funding necessary for the kind of. So you and I, we both swim in this stuff all the time. We
Mm-hmm.
can admire the problem all day long, but even within that reality, help me see what are some of the solutions that are still right in front of us that we can consider when we're living in that reality.
Yeah, there's, we talked about barriers. There's a lot of barriers to this work. I think very simply, we do need to move beyond admiring the problem, right? I was just talking about this was one that the first step is kind of just finding the next right thing to do. Um, and that could and is different for everyone. Um, it could be that your district leadership develops a vision for what things could look like in your district. That could be a next step. It could be that you reflect on co-teaching practices or developing co-teaching practices in your school or district. Because like you said, not everyone is practicing that. Co-teaching isn't in the isn't in the IDEA, you know? Um, and so it's something to move us forward. Um, it could be that you develop a task force of parents and advocates and educators to reflect on what the community needs to, yeah, how the community feels like it needs to change. Um, it could be that you're looking at social emotional learning or behavior support practices to make sure that that's equitable, and that you are supporting all learners in that aspect. Um, it could be that you look at your core one, your tier one core instruction, and making sure that as many educators as possible are providing really, really strong tier one. So there's a lot of different ways to get at the problem, because it's not going to get fixed overnight. But I think the important thing is you need to start. You just need to start. Um, and that takes that takes a leader. It takes a leader like the ones that are listening, right? To say, I can do something about this. I remember, I don't know if you're familiar with the school, the Chime Charter School in Los Angeles. The principal, I believe that he's still there. His name is Aaron Studer. And this was, gosh, this was years ago now, but probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Um, I traveled to California. I'm originally from California, but I had gone back for a conference, and I had set up a meeting to go to this fully inclusive charter school in Los Angeles, and I had an interview with Aaron afterwards, and he told me this short story of that he was with a bunch of school leaders, so district administrators, from the Los Angeles area, and they're all sitting around kind of admiring the problem, right? Oh, wouldn't it be nice if we all could be inclusive, like, Chime, and like, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this? And he said he had to take a second and say, but wait a minute, like, we're the people, that can make the change. We are the people that can drive this work. We are the people who can set a vision. We are the people who can inspire our staff um, to learn and to grow in inclusive practices. So why aren't we doing that? And that struck me. That struck me because, I was never in an administrative role. I was always a classroom teacher and a support person, right? Um, so I was always the one trying to get people to like, hey, this is like, maybe we could do things differently, right? But I wasn't the person who was leading that work. But here's Aaron saying that those particular leaders are feeling like they're in the same position, yet they actually have um, some some authority to move this work forward.
I love that. Tim, I'm actually working on another book for education leaders, and I'm playing around with its titles. So, listeners, if you hear this title and someone steals it, then I'm going to use it anyway. But I'm thinking of the title, Whose Permission Are You Waiting For? Because
Mm,
what I've discovered
yeah.
in this work that we do is we so often create, I was just working on this chapter this morning before we got on. So often we create barriers within our own minds in addition to the ones that are created by the systems that we're in. And so, and again, this isn't because I'm some Pollyanna-ish person who believes that there's an easy solution to everything, but you said so many wise things that I just want to touch on a few of them. One is find the right next step and take it. And you listed just a category of things people could consider because it's going to look different for everyone. Maybe you said that you need to develop a vision for what things could look like, or maybe you need to think about co-teaching practices, or maybe you need to form a task force of educators and parents for what the community needs to change. Or maybe you need to re-examine your behavioral standards for all students. Or maybe you need to really focus on tier one instructional support so that everyone is getting really strong instruction happening across the school. You listed a category of things that any school could consider because every school is different and you need to know which is the pain point that you might need to address. But all of that happens within the context of educators being willing to take a look and say, I see something that needs to be improved, and I need to stop waiting for someone's permission to do what I can do.
Mm-hmm.
Because when someone finds the courage to do to stop admiring the problem and begin doing the things that they can control, then action happens. Um, and I wish I could say I could take credit for the idea to implement and introduce co-teaching into my former school, but it was other people within my building who saw that vision and brought that to us. And we were able to work it into our master schedule. We were able to prioritize that, and we were able to start training. So as someone who's been on the other side of educators who dream of something and are like, let's try this, I just want to encourage listeners, whether you're in a position of leadership or support, whether you're an aspiring leader, whether you're currently practicing as a principal, what is that? Where is that area that you would dream to see better inclusion happening with all your students? And what's just one thing you can do toward that end, and then have the courage to take the step? And so, as we wrap up this conversation, Tim, I wanted to introduce you to this audience because you guys are just a treasure trove of resources. And I know you support Maryland, but you support educators across the country. So, how can listeners connect with Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education? Tell us a little bit about your podcast because you are an active podcaster, and then so any parting thoughts of wisdom that you have for listeners.
Absolutely. Well, Will, thank you so much for having me on. This has been a really great conversation. So mcie.org is the easiest way to interact with us. We have a contact page. Feel free to ask us questions. Um, we are actively looking for partners. So if this work sounds intriguing to you, our work begins with a conversation. So just get in touch, and then we'll see what happens. Um, as far as resources go, we have a resources page on the website, and I'm just going to call out one resource right now for you to check out. It's the Quality Indicators of Inclusive Schools. It's a self-assessment tool based on the framework that we've developed for effective and inclusive education. Definitely check that out. There are a number of different examples of what inclusive education could look like in your school or district. So definitely check that out. And then again, if you have any questions, uh, we have two podcasts. We have a weekly interview podcast called Think Inclusive, which Will, you're going to be on soon to chat with us. But I interview people from all across the educational landscape. Some are educators, some are parents, some are disabled activists and advocates. Some are filmmakers, some are authors. And we're all just trying to tackle this really big problem. How can we create a more inclusive world? But definitely check that out. Um, we have a catalog of, I think, over 140 episodes. So there's a lot there. And then the other podcast is a narrative podcast called Inclusion Stories, which is a 5-part series where I tell the stories of families in Georgia and in California that are seeking full inclusion, full and authentic inclusion for their children. And then I also highlight fully inclusive schools and districts in Maryland and in the state of Washington and in Oregon. There's one district in Oregon that we highlight as well. And I wanted to leave you, um, anyone who's listening, with kind of the big idea of that podcast. The reason why I wanted to share inclusion stories with the world is that it's so difficult to explain what we mean by full inclusion. A lot of people think it's one thing. They think that full inclusion means students with and without disabilities in general education classrooms all day, every day, no matter what, and often without the support they need. A lot of people think that that's what we're talking about, and it's absolutely not what we're talking about when we're advocating for authentic inclusion. But what this podcast series does is it really uh, it shows the nuance of from the family perspective, and then also from the school and district perspective of how they go about not only changing their practices, but sustaining those practices. And then kind of like what we talked about today with just starting, we don't need perfect inclusion. We don't need just a few people, who has figured it out and they're the only ones we look to. What we need is we need a lot of people, millions of people, starting and attempting inclusion, and figuring it out and working through the steps and growing and collaborating. We need many, many more people doing that, because that is what eventually is going to change our systems. So that's what I encourage everyone listening to do, is to start, even if it's scary, even if we don't know exactly what we're doing, because there's always room to grow.
What a beautiful reminder, Tim, of what should be happening in every classroom setting and what we all said we're committed to as educators, which is that learning cycle. When we don't know how to do something, we start and we take risks and we collaborate and we implement, and then we refine and we reflect and we try again until we improve and until we're adapting new practices. And so thank you for the call to all of us to think more inclusively. And Principal Matters listeners, I'll connect you with all of the resources and links that Tim mentioned. But Tim Villegas, thank you so much for what you're doing with the Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education, for what you're doing for students and families and teachers across the U.S. And Principal Matters listeners, thank you for taking time today to learn. And until next time, thanks for doing what matters. We'll talk to you soon. You'll find free resources like this one at williamdparker.com. Subscribe for our free weekly newsletter, which contains bonus material, and also check out the links for Grow Academies, Masterminds, Executive Coaching, and Keynote presentations for my books, as well as for Principal Matters Associates. You can find out more under our speakers tab at williamdparker.com. Thank you for learning together, and thank you for doing what matters.